A soldier lay trapped in the trunk of a rusted car, his body bruised, his hope slipping away in the cold Cleveland dawn. Just when he thought it was the end, the trunk creaked open, and there stood a little girl, no more than 9, with messy brown hair, a scar above her brow, and a loyal German shepherd by her side. She freed him with trembling hands, but when his eyes met hers, his heart nearly stopped. She looked exactly like the daughter he thought he had lost forever. What followed is a story of survival, faith, and the miracle of second chances. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever be forgotten, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear may change the way you see the world. The biting cold of dawn hung heavily over Cleveland, Ohio, a city where the skyline was often shrouded in smoke and fog, and the hum of factories never truly ceased. On the outskirts, beyond the neighborhoods of tired brick houses and shuttered shops, sprawled a junkyard filled with the skeletons of forgotten cars. Rusting frames stood like tombstones, glass shards glittered faintly beneath the pale morning light, and the scent of oil and damp metal floated thick in the air. The February wind cut sharp against the rows of twisted steel, carrying with it a silence that felt too deliberate, as if the yard itself was holding its breath. Inside the trunk of a battered sedan, a man stirred. His name was Jack Thompson, 38 years old, a former U.S. Army sergeant who had returned from tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, carrying more scars inside his mind than on his body. He had once been tall and broad-shouldered, a soldier whose mere presence steadied those around him. Now, in the dimness of the trunk, his short dark hair was matted with sweat and blood, streaks of gray glinting near his temples, and his hazel eyes blinked open in groggy pain. His rugged face bore the days of hardship he had endured since returning to civilian life, a life that often felt foreign and unwelcoming. He was dressed in faded jeans and a military jacket worn so thin at the elbows that the fabric had frayed. Around his wrists, duct tape dug harshly into his skin, cutting off circulation, and every breath he drew sent knives of pain through his ribs. Jack tried to recall how he ended up here. The last memory before darkness had been the face of Richard Hayes, an old comrade turned bitter enemy, a man who now trafficked in stolen weapons and scraps of war left behind. Jack had refused to join his schemes, and in the quiet of a parking lot the night before he had been struck from behind, the taste of copper flooding his mouth before the world collapsed. Now he was locked away like cargo, left to suffocate among the corpses of cars. He tried to move his arms, but the tape was too tight. He let out a low groan, throat parched, body stiff. His instincts sharpened, the old military reflexes rising. Even injured, even trapped, a soldier never surrendered to fear. He forced himself to breathe steadily, counting seconds, scanning sounds. And then he heard it, a faint shuffle, the clatter of a tin can knocked over somewhere in the yard. His heart hammered. Were they coming back to finish him? He braced, ready to fight with whatever scraps of strength he had left. Instead, a small shadow darted between the cars. Emerging from behind the hood of a rusted pickup was a girl, no more than 9 years old. Her name was Sophie Carter. She was a slight, wiry child with long brown hair tangled into knots and clothes that were 2 sizes too big, patched at the knees and frayed at the sleeves. Her sneakers were scuffed and mismatched, and an old backpack nearly as large as she was weighed down her small shoulders. Her face, though smudged with dirt, was delicate, with wide gray eyes that held both innocence and a caution far older than her years. Above her right eyebrow, just visible beneath the messy strands of hair, was a faint crescent-shaped scar. Trailing behind her was Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd, his black and tan coat dull from city grime yet still carrying the proud frame of a working dog. His amber eyes glowed with intelligence and his upright ears twitched at every sound. Max moved with a cautious grace, muscles rippling beneath his fur, tail low and steady as he sniffed the air. A faint limp lingered in his gait, hinting at a past injury that had never fully healed. Despite this, there was an undeniable nobility about him, the kind of loyalty only seen in dogs who had endured both hardship and love. When Sophie's eyes caught the faint movement inside the trunk, she froze. Max stepped forward, growling softly, his body tensing between the girl and the danger. Jack forced his cracked lips to form words. "Please, help me," he rasped, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. Sophie hesitated, glancing around as if expecting an adult to appear. Her small fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack. "You're hurt," she whispered, her tone wavering between fear and concern. Jack nodded slowly. "Bad people did this. I need to get out." Max gave a sharp bark, startling Sophie, but then quieted as he sniffed the air near the trunk, his instincts telling him this man was desperate but not threatening the girl. Sophie, emboldened by her companion's calm, placed her bag on the ground. "I can untie knots," she said matter-of-factly. "Grandma taught me. She says strong knots can save lives." She climbed closer, her small hands surprisingly nimble as she tugged and pulled at the tape binding Jack's wrists. Jack's vision blurred, but he could not tear his eyes away from her face. The scar, the tilt of her head when she concentrated. The resemblance was unbearable. His chest ached not just from broken ribs but from a surge of memory. Emily, his daughter, laughing on a swing, brushing hair from her brow with the same motion. Emily, lost 2 years ago in a rain-slick accident when the car had gone over the bridge into the river. Her body had never been found. The tape snapped, and Jack's arms were free. He tried to sit up, muscles screaming in protest. Sophie stepped back quickly, unsure, but then extended her thin arms toward him. "I'll help," she insisted. With surprising strength, she and Max together steadied him as he crawled out of the trunk, collapsing onto the frozen ground. The air hit his lungs like fire, and his eyes watered against the gray light. When he finally looked at Sophie clearly, the words escaped him before he could stop. You look exactly like my daughter." Sophie blinked, startled, and stepped back. Max pressed against her leg, his amber eyes fixed protectively on Jack, ready to lunge if needed. Jack raised his palms quickly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. It's just..." His voice broke, emotions tangled with pain. "You remind me of someone I loved very much." Sophie studied him quietly, her head tilting just so, and Jack's heart clenched tighter. She did not answer, but Max gave a short snort, almost as if sensing the weight of grief in the man before them. Suddenly, Max's ears pricked sharply. He darted toward a pile of rusted doors, barking low. Sophie turned, nervous. On the dirt, Jack noticed 2 fresh footprints, larger than a child's, pressed into the mud. Nearby lay a scrap of torn cloth, dark with grease. His soldier's instincts flared instantly. Whoever had locked him in the trunk might still be around. Pain radiating through his ribs, Jack forced himself upright, leaning against the car frame. His body screamed in protest, but his mind sharpened. Combat training never left. He scanned the junkyard, every shadow, every noise. The place, once silent, now seemed alive with hidden threats. Sophie bit her lip, sensing his tension. "They'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," Jack answered quietly. His hazel eyes hardened, the old steel of a soldier returning. "But I won't let them hurt you." Max growled again, standing at alert, the perfect guardian at the child's side. And in that frozen moment, among the rusted bones of abandoned cars, a wounded soldier, a fragile girl, and a loyal German shepherd found themselves bound together by chance, or perhaps by something far greater. The winter sun in Cleveland was pale, as though it lacked the strength to burn through the ever-present haze. Snow from a storm 2 nights ago still clung stubbornly to the gutters, and the city wore its gray like a weary coat. Jack Thompson lay half-conscious in the back of an old pickup that bounced along a cracked road toward the nearest hospital. The 2 truckers who had found him were simple men, broad-shouldered, grease-stained, reeking faintly of tobacco. They muttered between themselves, glancing back at Jack from time to time. His face was ghostly, bruises dark across his temple, ribs strapped with makeshift bandages one of them had torn from his flannel. Jack's hazel eyes opened only in brief slits, and his thoughts flickered in and out like a failing radio signal. What stayed with him, however, was the image of a child with a crescent scar and the loyal dog at her side. When Jack awoke again, he was beneath the antiseptic lights of Cleveland General Hospital. A nurse with neat blonde hair tucked under her cap leaned over him, adjusting the IV in his arm. She introduced herself as Nurse Danielle Brooks, mid-30s, slender, with a calm authority in her blue eyes. She had worked long years in trauma wards, and though she carried kindness in her tone, there was an edge of weary steel shaped by endless double shifts and the quiet despair of seeing too many broken bodies. "You're safe now," she told him. You were lucky those men brought you in when they did. Jack struggled to sit up, his body aching from every joint. His military training made him restless, the need to move, to assess. Soon enough, a police detective appeared to take his statement. Detective Howard Briggs was a man in his 50s with thinning hair combed flat, a paunch pressing against his belt, and a permanent frown etched into his face. He had seen too much of Cleveland's underbelly, and his cynicism showed in the way he chewed gum slowly while flipping open his notepad. Jack told him about Richard Hayes, about the shady weapons deal turned sour. Briggs wrote it all down but offered no reassurance. "We'll look into it," he muttered, though his tired tone suggested he doubted justice would come swiftly. Meanwhile, beyond the sterile walls of the hospital, Sophie Carter was making her way through the alleys of a poorer district, Max trotting faithfully beside her. She had not stayed to be thanked by the stranger in the trunk. Fear of adults, drilled into her by harsh experience, ran deep. Sophie moved with the nimble caution of a street cat, her backpack clinking faintly with scrap metal she and Max had dug out of the junkyard that morning. Sophie's cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, but her determination was unwavering. Her life revolved around her grandmother, Clara Ellis, a woman in her late 60s who had weathered more storms than most could endure. Clara had once been a seamstress, her back bent over machines in a factory that had since closed. Years of poverty had left lines across her thin, angular face, but her gray eyes retained a fierce dignity. She wore her silver hair tied into a simple bun, and though her frame was frail, her spirit carried strength enough to shield the girl she had found 2 winters ago on the banks of the Cuyahoga River. Sophie had been half dead, clothes torn, memories blank, and Clara, guided by both instinct and compassion, had taken her in. That morning, Clara sat bundled in a threadbare shawl inside their one-room apartment above a shuttered hardware store. The smell of damp plaster filled the air. She coughed into a rag as Sophie entered, her small arms carrying the day's collection of copper wire and cans. Max shook off snow near the door, his ears twitching at the distant laughter of children outside. Clara's cough worsened, her shoulders trembling. Sophie dropped the bag with a clatter and hurried to fetch her grandmother a cup of hot water. "Grandma, we'll sell these today." "I'll get the medicine you need," Sophie said firmly. Her voice carried the conviction of someone far older than 9. Clara touched her cheek with a weathered hand, eyes filled with both gratitude and sorrow. "You shouldn't have to carry such burdens, child," she whispered. But Sophie only smiled with the resilience of a soul hardened early. Later, Sophie and Max carried the bag of metal through the streets to the recycler. On the way, a group of boys loitered near a corner store. They were local troublemakers, older than Sophie by 3 or 4 years, with sharp faces and mocking eyes. One of them, a lanky kid with a torn denim jacket, sneered, "Hey, scrap girl, what have you got there?" "More trash?" They circled her, jeering, trying to snatch the bag. Sophie clutched it tight, but Max was quicker. With a low, menacing growl, the German shepherd bared his teeth, hackles rising like a storm. The boys froze, their bravado evaporating under the dog's glare. "Crazy mutt," one spat, and they scattered. Sophie knelt to hug Max around his thick neck. "Good boy," she murmured, her voice trembling from both fear and relief. Max licked her hand, tail wagging once, proud of his duty. By dusk, Sophie had earned just enough money from the recycler to buy Clara's cough medicine and a loaf of bread. The pharmacist at the small drugstore knew the girl well, an older woman with sharp glasses who often slipped Sophie an extra cough drop or 2. Sophie thanked her shyly and hurried home through the snow. That night, Clara asked her about the day. Sophie hesitated but eventually whispered about the man she had found in the junkyard. Clara's eyes narrowed with worry. "You must be careful, Sophie. We cannot draw attention. There are dangers in this city, more than you know," Sophie promised, but as she lay curled up beside Max on their thin mattress, the image of the man's face returned to her mind, his desperate gratitude, his broken voice, and the way he had stared at her as if he knew her. Back in the hospital, Jack drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by memories. He dreamed of the desert sun, of friends lost in ambushes, of Emily's laughter echoing from the porch of their old home. Every time he closed his eyes, Sophie's face appeared, overlapping with Emily's, until he no longer knew where memory ended and reality began. When he finally woke fully, Detective Briggs was gone. leaving only a card on the table. Jack gripped it in his bruised hand and swore to himself he would find the girl again. Something in his bones told him she was no ordinary child, and his instincts as a soldier and as a father would not let him ignore it. The city outside moved on with its weary rhythm, but two paths had crossed that morning in the junkyard. A soldier searching for redemption, and a child whose true story had yet to be told. And between them stood a loyal dog, whose watchful eyes seemed to know that fate was far from finished with them. The sky over Cleveland cleared after several gray days, revealing a fragile winter sun that painted the snowdrifts with fleeting streaks of gold. Jack Thompson stepped out of the hospital 3 days after his rescue, his ribs bound tightly and bruises still fading on his face. The cold air cut like a blade against his skin, but he welcomed it. After years of harsh deployments overseas, discomfort had become a strange kind of companion. Yet now there was something new, driving him forward, a gnawing need to find the child he had seen in that junkyard, the girl who bore his lost daughter's face. He returned first to the site of his imprisonment. The junkyard sprawled like a rusted graveyard of machines, its twisted metal husks casting long shadows over the snow. Jack carried a small paper bag filled with sandwiches, a bottle of water, and a chocolate bar he had picked up from a corner store. His steps crunched on shards of glass and frozen gravel. He found the black sedan where he had been trapped. The trunk still hung slightly open, tape remnants scattered nearby. Kneeling, he set the food carefully on the hood of a nearby van. "For you, little one," he murmured to the empty air, hoping Sophie would return. The days that followed tested his patience. He returned each morning, leaving packages of food and small items, mittens, a scarf, even a bright red rubber ball he thought the dog might like. He sat quietly under the skeletal frame of an old bus, watching and waiting. Once he caught sight of small footprints in the snow near where he had left a sandwich the day before. Another time, he heard the distant bark of a dog echoing between the rows of cars, but the child never showed herself. On the fourth morning, as the pale sun broke through the haze, movement flickered at the far end of the junkyard. A figure emerged cautiously from between two wrecked trucks. Sophie, bundled in a patched coat too large for her slender frame, clutched a backpack to her chest. At her side bounded Max, the German shepherd, his black and tan coat gleaming in the frosty light. The dog froze when he spotted Jack, ears erect, muscles taut with suspicion. Sophie's eyes widened, torn between recognition and fear. Jack raised his hands slowly, palms open. "It's me, the man you helped." His voice was steady, gentle. "I wanted to thank you, and I brought something for your friend." He reached into the bag beside him and rolled the red rubber ball across the snow. Max's gaze flicked to Sophie, waiting for her signal. She hesitated, then gave the faintest nod. Max trotted forward, sniffed the ball, and with a sudden burst of puppy-like joy, seized it in his jaws. He bounded back to Sophie, tail wagging furiously, the ball squeaking between his teeth. Sophie's lips curved in the smallest of smiles, the first Jack had seen. She inched closer, her boots crunching on the snow. "Why are you here?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the timidity of a child unused to strangers. Jack lowered himself to sit on a rusted tire, wincing as his ribs protested. "Because I wanted to see you again. Because you saved my life." He studied her carefully, noting how the morning light caught the crescent-shaped scar above her eyebrow, identical to Emily's. Even the way she tilted her head slightly while listening mirrored his daughter's old habit. Max, emboldened by the ball, trotted to Jack and dropped it at his feet. Jack chuckled despite himself and tossed it gently. The dog darted after it with the enthusiasm of a younger pup, returning to place it proudly back at his boots. "Seems your friend has decided to trust me," Jack said. Sophie's cautious stance softened, and she sat a few feet away, hugging her knees. "Max doesn't trust easily," she whispered. They talked in fragments that morning. Sophie revealed little, but she admitted she lived with her grandmother, Clara. She spoke of collecting scrap, of selling cans, and of Clara's cough that grew worse in the winter nights. Her words carried a maturity that made Jack's chest tighten. No 9-year-old should sound so practiced in the hardships of survival. Yet beneath her guarded tone, Jack sensed a yearning for something more, perhaps a memory not fully extinguished. That evening, after Sophie and Max disappeared once again into the fog, Jack walked the long path back to his house. His home stood on the edge of the city, a modest two-story structure of brick and wood once filled with laughter. He had not entered Emily's room since the accident. The door had remained closed, a shrine to loss. But tonight something pushed him forward. With trembling fingers, he turned the knob. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets that his late wife used to tuck in drawers. The walls were painted pale yellow, the color Emily had chosen. Her books lay in neat rows, a stuffed rabbit slumped on the bed. On the nightstand, beneath a layer of dust, lay a small blue velvet box. Jack opened it with reverence. Inside lay a silver star-shaped pendant, its delicate chain broken. Emily had never removed it until that night on the bridge. Jack closed his fist around it, his eyes burning with tears he refused to shed. "She's out there," he whispered to the empty room. "I know she is." The next day at the junkyard, Sophie appeared sooner, Max bounding ahead with his ball. She no longer kept as much distance, though she still glanced around nervously as if afraid of being caught. Jack handed her a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Turkey and cheese," he said lightly. "Better than scrap, don't you think?" She accepted it with hesitant fingers, her eyes never leaving his. As she ate, he told her stories, not about war or violence, but of fishing trips with Emily, of teaching her how to ride a bike. Sophie listened intently, her green-brown eyes reflecting a flicker of recognition that she herself did not understand. Max interrupted their conversation by nudging Jack's hand with the ball again. Jack tossed it farther this time, laughing as the dog bounded after it, ears flapping, paws scattering snow. For a brief moment, the junkyard no longer seemed bleak but alive with the joy of simple play. Sophie giggled softly at Max's antics, a sound so pure and fleeting that Jack's heart ached. As twilight descended, Sophie stood, brushing snow from her coat. "Grandma will be waiting," she said. Jack nodded, though every part of him wanted to keep her there. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said quietly. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. Max trotted to her side, the ball clamped triumphantly in his mouth. Together they disappeared into the maze of rusted cars, leaving Jack standing in the fading light, the silver pendant heavy in his pocket and a fragile hope blooming in his chest. The icy winds off Lake Erie howled across Cleveland that morning, rattling the windows of Jack Thompson's modest house. He sat at his kitchen table nursing a cup of black coffee, his ribs still sore but his mind consumed with only one thought. Sophie and her grandmother Clara could not go on living beneath a concrete bridge. He had seen too much suffering in his years overseas, seen children huddle in ruins, seen mothers scavenge for scraps. He could not let that scene replay in his own city. Jack spent the next 2 days searching. He visited blocks of worn-down apartments, spoke with weary landlords, and walked through narrow hallways that smelled of dust and mildew. Finally, on the edge of a quieter neighborhood, he found a small 2-bedroom apartment on the second floor of a red brick building. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, a balding man in his 50s with kind blue eyes, explained the unit had been empty for months. Jack signed the lease without hesitation. He spent the afternoon buying second-hand furniture, a sturdy bed, a dining table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a small couch. In the yard behind the building, there was a patch of grass fenced off by a chain-link barrier, a perfect place for Max to run. When Jack returned to the overpass that evening, Sophie was crouched near a barrel fire, Max lying protectively across her legs. Clara Ellis sat beside her, wrapped in a faded gray coat. Clara was a woman in her mid-60s, her hair a cloud of silver tied back in a simple bun. Her thin frame and sunken cheeks bore testimony to years of hard labor, yet her back remained straight, her hazel eyes unwavering. Life had weathered her, but not broken her. She was wary of strangers, shaped by loss and hardship, yet her voice, though hoarse, carried quiet strength. Jack approached slowly, his breath fogging in the night air. "I found you a place," he said, his voice firm. Clara's brows knit together. "We don't take charity. Take—" She coughed into her sleeve, the sound raw, painful. Jack crouched so his eyes met hers. "It's not charity. Sophie saved my life. I'm repaying a debt. Please, just come see it." Sophie looked from her grandmother to Jack, hope flickering in her tired green eyes. Clara finally nodded. The next morning, Jack drove them across the city in his old pickup truck. Sophie pressed her face to the frosted window, whispering to Max, who had his paws braced against the seat, tail wagging. Clara sat stiffly, clutching a cloth bag with all their belongings, 2 blankets, a small tin of coins, and a faded photograph of her late husband. When they pulled up to the red brick building, Sophie gasped. "It looks like a castle," she said, her breath fogging the glass. Jack smiled. "Not quite, but it's yours." Inside, Sophie darted from room to room, her laughter filling the bare walls, as she discovered the bed with clean sheets, the small desk by the window, and the patchwork quilt Jack had placed carefully across the mattress. Max bounded behind her, nails clicking on the wooden floor, his amber eyes shining with excitement. He leapt onto the bed and sprawled out, claiming it as his own, earning Sophie's giggles. Clara stood at the doorway, silent, her hand pressed against the wall as if testing its solidity. Tears glistened in her eyes, though she quickly brushed them away. "Thank you," she murmured at last, her pride softening into gratitude. The next week brought more change than Sophie had known in years. Jack arranged for her enrollment at the neighborhood elementary school just 3 blocks away. On the first morning, Sophie wore a plain blue dress Jack had bought from a thrift shop, her hair brushed neatly, though her nervous fingers tugged at the hem. Max trotted beside her, tail high as if escorting a queen. At school, Sophie was both a curiosity and a target. Some children welcomed her, fascinated by Max's loyalty. Others whispered and laughed at her second-hand clothes. During recess, a boy named Tyler, tall for his age with a shock of red hair, mocked her and tried to snatch her lunch. Max, sensing Sophie's distress, bounded across the playground and barked sharply, his deep voice echoing against the brick walls. Tyler stumbled back in fear, and teachers rushed over, shouting at the sight of the dog. Yet instead of chaos, the incident drew admiration from many classmates, who crowded around Sophie afterward, eager to pet the protective shepherd. For the first time, Sophie felt she belonged to something larger than survival. That evening, Clara brewed soup in the small kitchen while Jack sat with her at the table. The air smelled of onions and broth, warm and comforting. Clara's face, though lined with age, softened in the glow of the hanging light. Jack found himself speaking of things he rarely shared. He told her of his deployments, of dusty streets in foreign towns, of comrades who never returned. He spoke of Emily, his daughter, her laughter, her love of painting, the night of the accident that had taken her from him. His voice cracked only once, and Clara reached across the table, her rough hand resting on his. "You carry many ghosts," she said gently, "but perhaps this child has been sent to heal them." Later that night, as Sophie brushed her teeth with a brand new toothbrush and Max curled on the rug at the foot of her bed, Jack stood in the hallway. He watched through the slightly open door as Sophie whispered to Max, hugging him tightly. The dog's tail thumped steadily, his eyes closing in contentment. Clara, leaning on the doorframe of her own room, met Jack's gaze. For a moment, 2 weary souls, scarred by different battles, shared silent understanding. The days turned into weeks. Sophie's laughter grew louder, her cheeks rounder with health, her eyes brighter. Max thrived in the apartment yard, chasing the ball Jack had given him, his muscles rippling with renewed vigor. Clara's cough lingered but grew less harsh in the warmth of their new home. And Jack, though still haunted, began to feel something stirring inside him, a fragile, unshakable hope. The first snow of December drifted over Cleveland, turning the streets into a pale river of white. Jack Thompson's truck rumbled slowly along the icy road, its wipers struggling against the steady fall. In the back seat, Sophie leaned against Max, her small hand buried in the shepherd's thick black and tan fur. Max sat upright despite the cramped space, amber eyes alert, ears pricked as if aware that this journey meant something important. Beside her, Clara Ellis sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her lined face tense, eyes fixed straight ahead. Jack had finally made a decision. He couldn't ignore the haunting resemblance between Sophie and Emily, his lost daughter. Too many details aligned. The scar, the tilt of her head, the shade of her eyes. He knew he owed Clara everything for protecting Sophie, but he also knew the truth had to be faced. That morning, he invited them to his home, a place he hadn't fully opened to anyone since Emily's disappearance. The truck turned onto a long driveway flanked by leafless oaks. At the end stood Jack's modest 2-story house, built of weathered stone and wood, with windows that reflected the gray sky. It wasn't grand, but it carried memories, some beautiful, some unbearable. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the furnace washed over them. Sophie's eyes widened at the sight of the spacious living room, the shelves lined with books, the framed photographs of a smiling girl who looked disturbingly like her. Jack led them upstairs. His boots echoed against the polished floor until he stopped at a pink-painted door at the end of the hall. For a long moment he hesitated, hand resting on the knob, his throat tight. Then he pushed it open. Inside was a room frozen in time. Pink walls decorated with faded posters of ballerinas, a canopy bed covered with a quilt of soft roses, dolls neatly lined on a shelf. And sitting on the desk, untouched for years, was a stuffed teddy bear with a faded blue ribbon tied around its neck. "Captain Teddy," Jack whispered, his voice trembling. He had given it that name when Emily was 5, after she insisted her bear was brave enough to command a ship. Sophie's small feet carried her into the room slowly, her breath shallow. She reached out, her fingers brushing the bear's worn fur. "I know this," she murmured, almost to herself. Her eyes flickered toward the vanity, where a small jewelry box sat. Drawn by some invisible thread, she opened it. Inside lay a silver star pendant, dulled by time but still gleaming faintly in the soft light. The moment Sophie touched the necklace, Max gave a sharp bark. The German shepherd's fur bristled, his body tense. He circled Sophie, whining low in his throat as if sensing the weight of what she was experiencing. His amber eyes stayed locked on the pendant, almost guiding her to hold it firmly. Sophie clutched the star tightly. Suddenly, her breathing quickened. Images surged in her mind, bright headlights on a stormy night, the deafening crash of metal against metal, icy water rushing in through shattered windows. She remembered the frantic struggle with her seatbelt, the sound of her father's voice calling her name, the terrifying cold that pulled her under. Tears welled in her eyes as she gasped. "The bridge. The water. I remember." Jack's chest clenched. He had spent countless nights replaying that storm in his mind, imagining Emily's last moments. To hear Sophie's voice echoing the nightmare was both torment and salvation. Clara's face paled. She reached for Sophie, pulling the child close as tears slid down her weathered cheeks. "It's time you know the truth," she said, her voice raw but steady. She looked at Jack, then back at Sophie. 2 years ago, after a storm, I was scavenging by the river. I found you lying on the shore, half dead, no memory, no name. I thought you were sent to me. I couldn't turn you over to the system, not when you had no one. I took you in, and since then you've been my granddaughter." Sophie buried her face against Clara's chest, sobbing, torn between the love she had known and the memories rushing back. Jack knelt in front of them, his large frame trembling. His hazel eyes glistened as he reached out but stopped short, respecting the bond between the two. "You saved her," he whispered to Clara. "You gave her life when I couldn't." I can never repay that. Clara looked at him through tears, her pride momentarily stripped away. "I didn't know she belonged to you. I only knew she needed love." Max pressed his head against Sophie's leg, whining softly as if to comfort her. Sophie lifted the star pendant, her tears falling onto its silver surface. "It was mine," she whispered. "I remember you gave it to me, Daddy." Her voice cracked on the word, uncertain but full of longing. Jack's breath caught. Hearing that word again after years of silence was like being pierced and healed at once. He bowed his head, tears falling freely. "Yes," he said hoarsely. "Yes, it was yours. And I am your father." The room was filled with silence then, broken only by Sophie's quiet sobs, Clara's trembling breath, and Max's steady heartbeat pressed against them. In that silence, grief and gratitude intertwined. A soldier who had lost everything, a grandmother who had saved everything, and a child caught between two worlds now found themselves bound together. Jack didn't demand. He didn't try to take Sophie away. Instead, he placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder. "She is ours," he said. "Both of ours. You gave her a family when fate took her from me. For that, I will always honor you." Clara nodded slowly, her body shuddering with both relief and sorrow. Sophie clung to them both, the star pendant glowing faintly between her small fingers, a symbol of the broken past and the fragile hope for a shared future. The winter sun in Cleveland spread its pale gold across rooftops dusted with frost, and for Jack Thompson the day felt like a judgment long delayed. He sat rigid in the hospital waiting room, his large hands clasped together until the knuckles turned white, hazel eyes fixed on the sterile floor. Beside him sat Clara Ellis, her silver-gray hair pulled back neatly, her patched coat speaking of poverty, but her bearing speaking of dignity unbroken by years of hardship. Sophie, though her real name was Emily, sat between them, legs swinging nervously, her small hand resting on the thick fur of Max, the German shepherd who never left her side. The dog's amber eyes glowed with the calm strength of a sentinel, his head pressed close to the girl as though to remind her she was not alone. The door opened and Dr. Rebecca Hayes stepped out. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall with auburn hair tied in a bun, her green eyes steady but softened by compassion born of long years delivering both joyful and devastating news. She carried a folder in one hand, and as she approached, she lowered her voice, glancing at the child. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Ellis, the results are back." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint beep of machines from down the hall. Jack rose slowly, his broad shoulders squared by instinct, though his knees felt weak, while Clara's grip tightened on her walking stick. Sophie tilted her scarred brow upward, her eyes wide. Dr. Hayes opened the folder. "The DNA confirms it. Sophie is Emily Thompson, your daughter." The words struck Jack like thunder. For a heartbeat, he could not breathe. Then his body sagged and he dropped heavily into the chair, burying his face in his hands as tears burned his eyes. Clara reached for his shoulder, her voice trembling. "I never hit her out of cruelty, Jack. I only knew a broken little girl left with nothing, and I did what I could." Jack lowered his hands, his weathered face wet but clear. He looked at Clara and spoke with a soldier's steadiness tempered by gratitude. "You saved her when fate tried to take her from me. Without you, she would not be alive. You are family, Clara." Always, Emily slipped her hand into both of theirs, her voice barely more than a whisper but filled with a child's unshakable hope. "Then we're all together now?" Jack forced a smile through his tears. "Yes, sweetheart." Together, Max gave a single bark, as though confirming the oath. In the weeks that followed, the shadows hanging over Jack's life began to lift. Detective Harris, weary and sharp-eyed, came to Jack's door one snowy afternoon. His trench coat was dusted with flakes, his expression grim but resolved. "Beckett's in custody," he reported. One of his men confessed. Attempted murder, conspiracy. The man will not see daylight again. Jack stood silent for a long moment, watching his daughter play with Max through the window. Then he turned back to Harris and simply said, "The war is over." Yet Jack did not dwell in vengeance. Instead, he poured his strength into creating the Max and Emily Foundation, using his savings and military pension to build a place that would serve children without homes and veterans struggling to find theirs. At the opening ceremony in a modest community center, city officials and neighbors gathered. Emily wore a yellow dress Clara had sewn by hand, her brown hair catching the light as she proudly held Max's leash. The mayor pinned a medal on the German shepherd, calling him a hero. Children laughed and clapped, rushing to pet Max, who accepted the affection with the calm pride of a soldier at ease. For the first time in years, Jack felt pride not rooted in combat but in healing. Life at home settled into a rhythm. Clara, though frail, moved with renewed purpose, filling the house with the scent of bread and the warmth of a true grandmother. Emily thrived at school, though the first weeks were hard. Some children teased her scar until Max's growl ended their cruelty, and from that day Emily walked a little taller. Jack often returned from foundation work to find his daughter sprawled on the rug with Max's head in her lap, while Clara dozed in a chair nearby. In those quiet evenings, he would take out his old guitar and play the lullaby Emily had once known, and slowly her eyes would flutter closed with the same trust she had shown years before. One evening, as spring approached, the family stepped out into the backyard together. The garden that had been neglected for years now showed patches of green. Emily threw a red rubber ball and Max charged after it, tail whipping the air. Clara laughed, a rare and beautiful sound, while Jack stood with his hands in his pockets, watching his daughter and his dog with a heart finally unburdened. The sun was setting, painting the sky with fire. Emily ran back, cheeks flushed, and clasped his hand. "Daddy, we're safe now, right?" He knelt and brushed the hair from her forehead. "Yes, Emily. Safe. And together." Always Max barked once more, sharp and certain, while Clara stood behind them, her face softened by pride. And as the four of them came together in the glow of the sunset, it was clear that out of brokenness had come a miracle, a family whole again, a promise of hope, and a future no longer haunted by loss. The journey of Jack, Emily, Grandma Clara, and their loyal dog Max reminds us that even in our darkest hours, miracles can still happen. Perhaps it was God's hand that allowed a child thought to be lost forever to be found, that gave a soldier who once lost hope a reason to believe again, and that turned a faithful German shepherd into a guardian angel. In our daily lives, we may overlook the small miracles around us, a smile, a helping hand, a kind word. Yet these are signs that love and faith are always present. If you believe that God still works wonders in this world, share this story so others can feel the same hope. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories, and pray that God blesses every one of us. Write one simple but powerful word in the comments. Amen.